Well, here's someone that I thought I'd never be discussing as it relates to the woke mind virus and the nonsense that we have to deal with, this Marxist culture war nonsense that's always just in our face, right? In Australia and particularly in other parts of the West as well. And it is this individual here, one of the greatest athletes and swimmers that we've produced in Australia. If you can see his name here, Keiren Perkins, and I think many Australians would know who Keiren Perkins is, and he is a legend on and off the field during his heyday. And even as a kid, I remember watching the Commonwealth Games and the Olympics and just being, wow, this guy is just an amazing athlete and just an amazing representation of what it means to be an Aussie. But of course, today, Kieren is finding himself as the CEO of the Australian Sporting Commission. He is now at the forefront in the minds of many Australians and women as someone who is pushing this ideological Marxist style cultural shift that's happening as it really relates to the impact that these things have on women's sports, right? And I'm talking about these particular guidelines that they've introduced around the inclusion of trans athletes and gender diverse peoples, as they've termed it, in sports, right? Whether that's in male sports or female sports, it's the inclusion of trans athletes in these sports. Now, we have seen, just from anecdotal evidence and just what happens out in the real world that we can observe, this usually more adversely impacts women's only sports, right? Female categories. We haven't really seen an impact that trans men, for instance, have had on male categories, but we always hear about the impact that trans women have on female only sports. And in my opinion, that just goes to show you the very natural, innate physical differences that men and women have biologically, that it's just even obvious in that very small fact that I just mentioned. Now, I can't go too deep into this because these days you have to be a quote unquote expert to talk about this topic without getting into trouble, right? There is this kind of movement happening where even discussion around this is a bit of a contentious issue. So I've got to be very careful. But there are scientists on both sides. But overwhelmingly now, we're seeing more of that corporatized media, more of government, and more of the scientific body who are a part of these diversity, inclusion style agendas and schemes come out on the side of trans athletes and against really the interests of women that some would say amounts to the erasure of women from particular sports, right? That's an argument that a lot of women make. And my personal opinion is I agree with these women. I think a lot of this actually adversely impacts women in a very negative way. But look, let's forget my commentary. Let's have a look at what Kieran Perkins is actually saying and what these guidelines kind of mean. And then we'll look at some of the commentary and the reactions to Kieran Perkins. And again, I think Kieren is a legend, and it's I don't take pleasure in criticizing him in this way, but it's all fair because he's signed up to this role. So this is from an article from the ABC. High performance guidelines released for transgender and gender diverse inclusion in Australian sports. The Australian Sports Commission has released its guidelines for the inclusion of transgender and gender diverse athletes in high performance sports, reminding sports governing bodies of their commitment to promoting a spirit of inclusion and abiding by Australian law. Australian Sports Commission CEO Kieran Perkins said the new guidelines were developed to offer clarity for domestic sports asked for. Australian sport must comply with the Sex Discrimination Act, which makes it unlawful to discriminate, harass, or victimize on the basis of sex and gender identity. Exemptions are allowed in sport where unfair advantage or safety risks can be objectively proven. Now, I'll just skip down to some of the comments here, and I'll link to this article as well in the description. The CEO of Australian Sports Commission, Kieran Perkins, told the ticket that the guidelines were developed to offer the clarity domestic sports asked for. In modern society, there is a need for us to provide far more diverse and safe opportunities for people to compete and be involved in sport. Community sport is one area where obviously inclusion is unquestioned and absolutely needs to be open and safe for all. But when you start moving into high performance sport, it does require a more nuanced conversation. What we've been able to do, working with medical professionals, people involved in sport, both cisgender and trans athletes, as well as the LGBTQ plus community and others, is to actually find the Australian context and come up with guidelines that allow for a pragmatic approach. Perkins, though, I don't know if this quote is directly attributed to him, but I think it's just a comment on the actual article. There is a misconception that men can wake up one morning, decide he's female, and be free to compete in women's category under inclusion guidelines. Perkins says that cannot happen. No, it can't. One of the things I guess I've been educated on is I'm yet to meet a transgender person who could ever reflect that their journey is as simple and as black and white and as blunt and as easy as that. All right, so that's from that article. If it gives you a bit of understanding, I'll just play the spot that Kieren did on the project in his own words.
You're one of the greatest swimmers of all time. Kate Campbell, one of our other great swimmers of all time. These regulations would be at odds with her public statements. I don't want to verbal her, but she's been on this program and she's spoken publicly about not wanting to compete against trans swimmers. I'll frame it that way. What would you say to Kate?
Look, I actually completely understand Kate's concerns and the concerns of many female athletes, because let's not forget our female athletes are underrepresented. They're not given the same opportunity as male athletes. We don't see the level and quality of female coaches at an international level, administrators, volunteers, the list goes on. So it is completely understandable that people within sport who have fought so hard for so long to get equality compared to their male counterparts see this as a challenge and a risk for them. What I'd say is let's sit down and have the conversation, talk through the issue, talk through where these guidelines lead us to, and let us assure you that no cisgendered athlete is going to be inadvertently disadvantaged through this, because we do want to provide equality, but we do want to ensure that it is an equitable place for all to compete.
Bit of double speak there. We do want to provide equality for all, but equitable also. And this is kind of how all this stuff is snuck in, right? And the debate really is around, do we need to have a system in place where it is so vague when it's so obvious that there's differences between men and women, and we've understood this for a long time, right? That's what women will say, that they don't want all this nuanced stuff and they don't want these discussions, they don't want these understandings, right? Kieren himself said on that spot, he's saying he's understood that the women have had to struggle in elite sports to get to a certain level in terms of their equality as compared to male sports. He actually admits that, but then he goes on to say, but, right? There's a but there. And the but now is really the inclusion of these trans athletes and these gender diverse athletes into this space by saying that, we have to now abide by certain Australian laws around discrimination, particularly at the grassroots community level. It's almost like it's a foregone conclusion, the way that these guidelines are drafted, right? Elite level, they're saying that you can have a nuanced approach, and that the reason that they're saying that is it's because at the elite level, when you're competing overseas, for instance, at the Olympics or whatever it is, those organizations have their own guidelines. So sometimes the Australian guidelines will be at odds with those guidelines of the IOC, for instance, or of FINA, the sporting body for swimming, if we look at swimming as an example. So that's the recognition of that. So generally what that means worldwide, there wouldn't be athletes in other countries, for instance, females competing with trans athletes at the community level. But in Australia, there will be trans athletes competing with females at the community level or at the domestic level, for instance, on these sports. And I think that's also a problem. I know the nuanced conversation can be had about elite sports, but I think a lot of women are saying that even at the grassroots level or even at community level, a young female aspiring to be a swimmer in the future now potentially has to compete with a trans athlete, right? And what does that do when that female maybe places second or third in that career progression, right? As a young athlete trying to aspire to be something in the future, is that going to damage that prospect? Potentially. I mean, it's very vague, and this is where a lot of this doesn't really get debated, and it's kind of left in the air. But look, that's just my opinion. I'll kind of revert now to the opinion of some of the people online, particularly these women's rights networks. So let me just bring it up here. So they've said, well, Australian Sports Commission boss Kieran Perkins, you'll be hearing from us. Australian sporting bodies were already implementing policies that undermine fairness in women's sports. And now this. Everyone Even one man in a women's team is unfair, and women deserve fair sport. Catherine writes, please remind Perkins that his fortune and fame that came from him winning gold in the 1500 meters was never afforded to any woman. Women were discriminated from this event for simply being female. Now he wants to continue the discrimination by allowing men in women's events. Shameful. And I think that refers to the time that when Keiren Perkins was competing in the 1500 meters, this is in the 90s, I think, and maybe the early 2000s, possibly. I could be wrong on the time frames. There was no 1500 meter event for women. I could be wrong. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's what that's in reference to. So, even just in basic sports like swimming, where there's events like the 1500 meter event, women weren't allowed in those events at the Olympic level, the elite level, and now we have those events. So women have had to win those rights over a long period of time. And this person's saying that, Kieran Perkins is erasing all those gains that women have made now by these type of guidelines. Mary J writes, what a disappointment Perkins has turned out to be. An entitled elite sportsman who competed without threat of unfair decisions to rob him of his place on the podium, of prize money, medals, or fame. He is a despicable, virtue-signaling narcissist who hates women. I mean, is that a fair criticism of Perkins, or you tell me? Someone wrote, save women's sports. Another person wrote, this is sad news. Kieran Perkins, what a disappointment. You had a chance to stand up for and be fearless, but Jane writes, so trans men are never a problem. Men don't care about women changing in front of them, and there seems to be very few trans men taking sports places. So it's just biological women who lose out again. Why is this never discussed? Abraham homosexualist writes, do remind the duplicitous creep that there is no such thing as a cisgender athlete. Normal people reject being dismissed as opposite to trans because normal people can't be redefined as a relative to what's abnormal. Unless, of course, you despise females enough to call them cis women. And Izzy Einstein writes, well, there we have it. Australia has banned female sports. Catherine Deves also wrote, breaking, Australian sporting authorities betray female athletes. Men with low testosterone are women for the purpose of elite sport. Not including men who claim to be women could be discrimination. Okay, generally that's kind of what the guidelines allude to. And then we have someone here supporting Kieran Perkins. So I just wanted to give the contrast. So Nikki here writes, well done, Ausport and Kieran Perkins, who have captured a well-reasoned policy that starts with inclusion in Australian sport that complies with our laws, and just shared an article about that. So, I mean, it is that kind of thing, right, where you do still have these mixed responses from the community, but overwhelmingly I'm seeing, at least on the responses that I'm seeing on social media and online, women are upset by these type of things. And look, need I remind Kieran Perkins just the basic differences here at the elite level, at least. The men's world record in the 1500 meters, the women's world record in the 1500 meters held by Katie Ledecky is 15 minutes and 8 seconds and 24 milliseconds, I think. Is it milliseconds, microseconds? I don't know. And then we have the male world record, which is 14 minutes and 31 seconds, 0.02. That's safer to say it that way. And that's held by Sun Young. Now, when we compare those two, there's about, I think, is that like almost a 40-second difference between the male record and the female record. And you can see just in there's a massive difference, right? And what we're being told now is by these sporting bodies, people like Kieran Perkins, these organizations, and of course by governments who are enabling this through their kind of laws, which are being passed at an alarmingly rapid rate, is that there is no difference and between men and women, or even if there are differences, at least in terms of how people can interpret that, we can find ways around that by, lowering testosterone or, going through this particular program, or 2 years proving that you are a female and so on, right? It complicates something that most women and most people in the community might regard as a very basic intrinsic part of our biology, right? Men and women. And that is where I'm going to leave this topic, because even it confuses me sometimes as well. Anyway, guys, if you enjoy my videos, you can follow me on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, Rumble, and Odyssey at The Real Rukshan. See you next time.